This here is the Beyond the Dojo podcast. I'm Lauren.
I'm Jeremiah.
We didn't actually come up with anything funny to say at the beginning of this podcast episode.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, I do just want to, maybe just a rant. Training on different flooring, I am such a weenie when it comes to changing the type of flooring that I'm training on. Like, I trained outside for like 5 years, like partially in the dojo on a dilapidated floor, but also in the dirt and on grass. So I don't know, you'd think I'd be able to train on multiple surfaces, but I'm sorry guys, I hate mats so much. It just doesn't feel the same at all.
I used to call people like that floor whores.
Well, I kind of am, because like my feet are sweaty and then I like grip with my toes. So when I go to turn, I just like catch my pinky toes or whatever on the floor. When I was 16, I went to my first seminar, and it was a dojo that had mats on the floor, and I jacked up my big toe and my pinky toe of my right foot right before my knee-on exam. And I had to tape my toes and test that way. Doing conga show. Slide across the floor. Yeah, it was not fun. So, yeah, I don't like those types of floors, but if you can do that, more power to you. Yeah. Do you people who have, like, super dry feet and you can slide across, like, any surface, I kind of envy you. Aren't you one of those people? Your feet are pretty dry.
Yeah, well, you know.
There's some of us, like, a lot of females particularly have sweaty feet, and we just, like, that whole, like, paper thin movement across the floor, if we do that, we get caught and we'll trip.
Oh, you mean, by we, you mean you?
I mean us females with sweaty feet, or us people with sweaty feet.
Are you their spokesman? Spokeswoman?
I am the sweaty feet spokesman.
There you go.
Okay, so one of our topics we've had on our list for a while is on instructors who live vicariously through their students.
Yeah, that can manifest itself in several ways.
Well, how about you kind of explain maybe what that is to start with? Because this idea was first introduced to me from Jeremiah, and I'll talk about that in a second.
All right, so as a youngster in Japan, I didn't get treated any way special. I was looked at as the outsider. You know, even if I'm half Japanese, they still looked at me as the gaijin or the foreigner. So I never experienced that. I've actually felt it the other way, where they would, you know, kind of not welcome me in fully, right? But when I moved back to the States, I started training. I was trained at a small dojo up in upstate New York. And in sports karate, I think it happens more than like traditional karate, where the sensei, you know, has a star student and is doing very well. And instead of allowing the student to be motivated and work on their own, they push them into really working and fine tuning and push. And, you know, it becomes to a point where I felt like the achievements were more about the sensei than they were about the person. Like, you know, I was competitive and I wanted it to succeed, but there was a point where I was like, you know, this is a bit much. Mm-hmm. Right. And, you know, maybe it's just me. I just felt like when I decided to slow down a little bit in my training and kind of relax in karate a little bit, there was a noticeable change in my relationship with my sensei at that time.
Like in what way?
Almost like, because I wasn't, I don't know, it's almost not like disappointing, but like it was a failure for the both of us, not just the.
You were a big fat failure.
We are a big fat failure, right? That kind of thing.
Because they were manifesting all that.
Right, and that kind of just it struck me, and then I realized there was several senpai and the sensei that were doing that, where they would, you know, base their joy or their fun or enjoyment of karate on how I performed.
How did you notice that?
Like I said, going through majority of my karate life up to that point, being the outcast, and then being the star pupil in a small dojo, and being successful and the welcome and embracing, and then kind of not doing that, kind of slowing down a little bit. You could feel like they're like, I felt it. Maybe I was hypersensitive, but I felt that slight outcast feeling again.
Yeah.
You know, and I was just like, you know, it is what it is, right? And then the more tournaments we went to, the more reffing I did and stuff like, I could see it in other teachers with their students. it was almost like that the Karate Kid with Cobra Kai guy, where it was you have to win, you have to be the best, or he gets there's these punishments, but it wasn't physical punishment. It was just this distancing of people, and then the ownership of your endeavors. It was like, yeah, I did that. I worked on that. Yeah, we did that. We won. We got good.
Yeah.
You failed.
Yeah.
It wasn't like there wasn't no we failed. It was you failed.
Yeah, I did my part as the teacher, but you didn't do your part.
Right,
as a
and
student,
it was like, and if we'd have done it my way, or you'd have done it like we wouldn't have this issue. And it's like,
yeah.
So that had a real sour taste in my mouth for a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, it burnt me out of karate. Like I got
that attitude towards
just the attitude and the whole the pressure and the stress and not owning my karate. The cool thing about being the outcast in Japan is like I was able to really enjoy what my karate was to me. Like as a youngster, I wanted to compete. I wanted to be successful. I wanted to make black belt. I wanted to do all these achievements because I'm the type of person that says you can't, or they kind of, they push you off to the side. I'm the person that says, I demand you respect me. You can't deny what I can do.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And that's a big motivator to me.
Right.
Like, I'll show you.
Right.
And then I got to the States, and I still had that I'll show you attitude, but it turned into, yeah, that's exactly what we want. But the moment I hiccuped, you failed.
Yeah.
It was like, it was so unnerving and so difficult to get over, and I had a burnt out a perspective on my karate.
Yeah.
And I get back to Florida, and I'm teaching more than I'm training as a kid.
Yeah.
And I'm 16 years old, and I'm teaching, kids at UF, at the UF club, because no one else would show up. Right. There would be no other higher belts to run the class. So I'd have to. And it's not like they would say, oh, you're teaching. It was just like I would show up and no higher rank would show up.
Right.
So, yeah.
So that was kind of the start of the burnout, was like realizing how the teachers were vicariously living through you.
Right.
And then everything else that came afterwards was just kind of the icing on the cake. Yeah.
Yeah. It was over the nail in the coffin, I guess.
Yeah. So when I was maybe like 18, 19 years old, we had a conversation where you said to me, you have a bunch of old men trying to live vicariously through you. And I looked at you like, what the hell are you talking about?
Yeah.
Can you explain to everybody what you saw, what you were witnessing happen to me?
Right. So that was our first seminar together, correct? It was it was Pensacola?
I think it was actually after that, because I think we knew each other better, because I listened to what you said, but I didn't really I didn't understand what you were talking about, because I was still kind of young and innocent and figured that everybody had the best things in mind for their students. Right. So, it was probably a little bit later down the road.
Yeah, so it wasn't just the doting, right? Like, karate guys, they're going to dote on young, talented people, right? They're going to love on them, and they're going to kind of dote on them. And it wasn't that. It was the things that they did when you weren't around. Beyond the pride. Like, yeah, that's my student.
Yeah.
It was like, yeah, that's, and it would be like they owned your actions. Yeah. Either in conversation and just the way they interacted with people. I just saw that. I said, yeah, that looks exactly like what I went through in upstate New York, where it was, it was all about, it turned into what it was all about them. Yeah. Right. So they'd be like, oh, Lauren did this, Lauren's this, Lauren's that. Right. But it wasn't like lifting you up.
Right.
It was self-indulging and it made them like, I achieved something. I've gotten that level. And then watching them correct on you, like constantly correct on you. One would come through, say something, literally 5 minutes later, someone else would come through and say something about your technique. Not like, hey, is this, talking like, how is this experience? What's going on? Is it was like constant little corrections as they passed through. That was like, and I had to think to myself, you got 4 or 5 of these dudes doing this to you. Yeah. How in the world are you processing the right one?
Yeah. Yeah, and that was extremely difficult. And I've had this conversation with others who came in like generations behind me. through the same dojo. One of the advantages that we had is that we had lots of different instructors. One of the disadvantages of that is that if those instructors are not all on the same page, then you get lots of different perspectives, and that's fine. But sometimes that turns into butting heads, and some of those instructors were very kind-hearted, and they were willing to accept that others had different points of view. Others were not kind-hearted about it, and it turned into, I think this is before you had ever pointed that out. I remember just working on Konkudai, just going to the starting position in Konkudai, like your ready position, you're about to start the kata. How to get into that position was argued between our 3 different instructors, and the way that it was argued was not face to face to each other. It was, I would go to one class and I would be told one way to do it, and then I would go to another class with another instructor, do it that way, and then they would say, why are you doing it that way? It should be this way. And I would say, well, no, this instructor said this. And they're like, well, no, they're wrong. You need to do it this way. And then I would go to the third instructor and I would do it one of those ways. And they're like, no, that's not right. It needs to be this way. And here's why. I mean, and it was that, but it was all the time. It got to the point that it was all the time. Right. And it was very, very irritating. So there was a tension between the instructors I was being kind of pulled into the middle of, which I'm not so sure that was them trying to, I guess they were just trying to get me to do what they wanted versus being able to accept that I was being influenced by multiple people, right, and being able to like allow me to do that. So I think that it was different than what you went through, because yours was very much of a competitive nature, like what, right, you see sometimes with, no offense guys, like baseball dads, right. How you see like, oh, yeah, parents will push their kids through a sport and they expect them to perform at a certain level. It wasn't really that. It was more so of, you need to do it my way. And right, if you don't do it my way, then you are somehow opposed to me, or you don't respect me, or whatever. That's the way that it came across. Right. And that actually, it was irritating at first, but then it got to the point where I was having to cut people off. And then it got worse and worse and worse. And that continued until I was in my early 20s, where I was literally having to start cutting people off. Some people I had to cut out of my life completely. Others I was having to just cut off. Like, I would listen to their teaching and I would do what they asked at that time and just accept that was what was going to be done during that time frame. But I had to basically make a decision about who I was going to allow to influence me. Yeah. So that was kind of my experience. It was a little bit different. It wasn't of necessarily a competitive nature. Right. And then I've experienced, living vicariously through my students as a teacher. Mm-hmm. Right. So when I first started training and teaching, Cal and running that dojo, mm-hmm, for some reason, it was beyond me to understand that there was different motivations to do karate. Right. So everybody, I now know it's obvious that everybody does karate for a different reason. Right. Yeah. Yeah. But as I was first teaching, all I could think was, yeah, everybody's doing karate to be the best at karate. Yeah. And that's how I taught. Yep. And, part of the reason why my dojo really never grew was because my attitude towards karate kept a lot of people that just wanted to do it for fun or exercise or community and like that were kind of kept off. Right. Would come but not stay. Mm-hmm. Right. And I had to learn that, everybody does karate for a different reason. There are standards, there's expectations, right? But there's not a drive like I had to make everybody, like, you have to do, let's get this right. And I was guilty of doing classes where we'd work on one technique, yeah, and I would do the same thing. That's not bad once in a while. Yeah. But when it becomes the norm, mm-hmm, like, oh, we're working on this technique tonight. Yeah. It's not the greatest, most enjoyable atmosphere. Yeah. Right? Even if you try to stay upbeat and happy about it, the repetition brings frustration. Well, I think it maybe depends on the level of the student, because I know what you're talking about, because I did the exact same thing, and I've done the exact same thing. But when you have a group of students that, like, you can read the room and you can obviously see, like, they're in this. I agree with you there. And, like, we've had classes with our, like, beginner-ish, intermediate level teens and adults, where all we've done is oizuki, but we did a bunch of different drills, and like it wasn't the exact same thing over and over again.
But the emphasis was oizuki, but it was different aspects of oizuki too, right?
and they were able to jive with it because they're like, yeah, it's the same thing, but we're doing something different.
Right. No, that's not how I was running those classes.
I originally wasn't doing my classes like that either.
And it took a lot of like being exposed to the idea that people do karate for different reasons.
Yes.
Right. Like hearing Rick say that, really opened my eyes, because I knew that, but did I apply it?
Right.
In my teaching in the way I did? No, I absolutely didn't. Right. So learning that, right? Learning that expectation of commitment was a hard thing for me to get over.
Yeah.
Right. And then the second thing, as a teacher, which I don't think I was guilty of, is when you teach and you want to teach to make everybody look exactly the way you do.
Yeah.
That's living vicariously through them. Right. So everything has to look. I mean, some dojos, it's cookie cutter.
Yeah.
You could watch them and it's like, that's the teacher. Oh, that's obviously the student.
Yeah.
Right. And then there's some dojos that you really can't see that. Right. And then there's few dojos where you could see the underlying theme, and it ties together everybody's karate, but there's slight subtle differences.
So it's principle based teaching.
Yeah, it's principle, and that's what attracts me to that.
Well, think about
individualism within the art itself. Right?
Think about Nakayama and the people of his generation, and then who came after him.
Right.
Those dudes don't look the same as each other.
Right.
They don't look the same at all. Now, granted, oftentimes you can tell current karateka's lineage by which of those instructors that came out of Japan, like which one they trained with. And I'm not making any implications about those guys. I don't know them. I've never trained with any of them. No. But those guys that came from Nakayama's dojo, it's pretty clear that they did principle-based training in the Humble Dojo, and then the way that it was applied in those guys' karate was different. Yeah. So I think too, like that whole very egocentric mindset, and then how it manifests in how you actually physically teach. I think there's this parallel between your ego versus your humility, and then also your ability to accept like efficient and effective teaching. Like those things kind of run along the same lines, and if you don't have the more spiritual aspect and the mental emotional aspect under control and your own ego under control, then I don't think you're able to very easily submit to ideas of yes, wax on, wax off. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Wax on, wax off. You're not able to easily submit to more scientifically based ideas or efficiency or principle based teaching. You're not able to accept that it's going to look different on different students. And I feel like our karate doesn't really look the same. Like you can tell that we have the same influence, but we really don't look that much alike. Part of it is because our body structures are totally different. Right. What's interesting is we're on the inside trying to look around, but I don't think our students really look like us necessarily either. Right. They all have very distinct looks about them. Mm-hmm. Like there are a couple of students I can think of who have very like crisp lines and very like almost like tournament style looking karate, not like inefficient, but they're just very precise in their positioning. And then we have others who are, maybe bigger guys, and they're not sloppy, but they're still working on the efficiency portion. The movement is getting there. They're working on the timing of their movements. So they're maybe in a different place of what they're working on, and you wouldn't really be able to tell that those two necessarily came from the same dojo unless you had an understanding of what karate looks like. Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know.
So, I think either way, in any case, when you try to vicariously live through your students, consciously or subconsciously, right, it is a detriment to the dojo, right? Yes. You're taking away from what the dojo should be. The dojo should be a family and community where people are allowed to express themselves under a guise of requirements, right? Under a structure of like, this is what we look at to be good.
And that's just objective. That is not like you controlling them.
This. Hey, these are some of the things that we think are proper for karate. Mm-hmm. do we support those requirements? We embrace them. We teach them. We encourage our students to do the same thing, right? But how they understand it, how it goes about, and how they perform it, it's really up to them.
Yes, and I think that we did not completely write our own syllabus. We took in a syllabus that we appreciated and adapted it to what we thought was helpful, but it's general enough that the student it's going to look different on each student if they're performing up to the syllabus level, but it's specific enough that we know what to look for if there are certain mistakes being made, or if there are certain principles that we want to look for. We're looking for principles of movement. We're not looking for them to look the way that we look and stroke our own ego and stuff. And a couple episodes ago we talked about students quitting, and I feel like that's another element of that, is like when you have a controlling sensei who is trying to like live through their student body, that it becomes more of an emotional roller coaster for a student, not just because their teacher is disappointed in them, but then also because when they try to quit, the teacher's even more disappointed in them, or it turns into this thing,
emotional thing.
Yeah, so I guess like the moral of the story if you're a teacher is like check yourself. Check how you're because I think I did the same thing early on, is like looked at my students like why don't you get this, like you should be doing this at this level, and it had too high of expectations early on, even with the students coming in and having different reasons for training. That was hard for me to accept for a while too, because like I have specific things that I want to accomplish in training and all of that kind of stuff, and not everybody wants that. But it's freeing as a teacher when you get to that point where you're like, I'm going to control what I can control, which what you can control is what you teach and your perspectives and how you treat your students. You can't control what someone does with the information that you give them.
Exactly.
You can't control their perspective on karate. There were many times early on in the dojo where I was just like, I don't understand why, these particular students quit. Why didn't they want to stick around? Why didn't they implement change? It's because they just looked at it in a different way. Karate was just maybe a phase for them. It wasn't something they wanted to implement long term. And I think if I had continued in that mindset of constantly like, why don't you see it the way that I see it? Why aren't you doing what I want you to do? I think it would have been really bad for me mentally as a teacher. So it puts you in a really bad headspace to try to control people like that.
Here's a sign or symptom that you're living through your students. When you expect a brand new beginner learning Heian Shodan to perform it like he's a black belt or she's a black belt, you might be living through them.
Or what you think is a black belt, like what you think it should look like.
So, for me, I look at a white belt doing Heian Shodan. Stances shouldn't be exact.
No.
They're still learning how to get there. They're still physically training themselves to be there. Right? The movement should be a little wonky. It should be. Now if the person has ability and they could pick up more subtleties, then we give them more, right?
Yeah.
But I don't expect them to be Shodan level doing Heian Shodan.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So.
And there's a difference between, like, kind of going back to the standards thing, there's a difference between being an elitist and being someone who is just a good teacher who has good standards. Yeah. And I feel like in today's culture, we don't really see the difference. And this does go along with the living vicariously through your students thing. It's like if you refuse to accept that people may or may not see things your way, or that when they implement your teaching, as long as it's principle based, that it might not look the way that you want it to look, if you can accept that, then that's okay. And there are ways that you can work with that student and apply the teaching to the student versus making the student adhere to only your teaching. That's not the way teaching is supposed to work. You're supposed to be able to take the ideas and give the information to the student and then help guide and adjust that, to make it basically perform up to a certain standard versus making them only adhere to your system and not be able to, use it for themselves.
Yeah.
So,
but to each their own.
Deep set insecurity. Is that what you said? Deep rooted insecurity. That's what people who live vicariously through their students. That's what they have. Yeah. And you run people off more than you keep them around.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, that's hard too, though, as a teacher, to accept your downfalls, right?
Yeah.
To accept that you know you're not perfect in your karate, and that you don't know everything, and you're not taught everything correctly. Mm-hmm. That you're still kind of flowing mm-hmm. with new information and constantly changing your karate, because that's what progression is, right? Mm-hmm. I think we were very fortunate to be told that we weren't doing things correctly in the most gentle way, right? And to point out why. And I think that example of how that was done to people who've been doing karate for over a decade, mm-hmm. maybe closer to 2 decades, mm-hmm. is a great example of how we should treat our students, right? Mm-hmm. Right is right, wrong is wrong, not based on what shape you make or how it looks, but based on efficient movement, and then just go from there.
The insecurity comment actually wasn't from you. I just remembered it was from Steve.
I was like, yeah.
No, you didn't say that. I've heard it so many times about a few days. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, no. You know, and we didn't even talk about...
Well, it's the ego thing, no matter what.
Yeah, and it has to also be like unmet expectations. Like maybe there's expectations you had of yourself, or like things that you didn't accomplish that you as a teacher were like, well, no, I didn't do it, so now my students are going to do it. Okay, so that is something that I went through. I know that we're totally all over the place and we're backtracking here, but that was something... one of my teachers, God rest him, he never tested for Sandan. And he was ready to test for Sandan. Things went wrong in his dojo. He left, whatever. And he, in his mind, I think, had it decided that he was going to be the influence to get me to that level. He was going to be the one that put the time in, brought the teaching in, and he was going to get me to that level because he never got to that level.
Right. Setting goals for your students that they didn't set for themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not that I didn't want to get to that level necessarily. It's just, you know, I didn't think that it would matter necessarily if a singular specific person was the influence at that time. I just didn't know, you know, who needed to be the influence of me, I guess. So.
Right. Well.
So if that is you, and you have unmet goals in your life,
right. Well,
be careful.
Yeah. Well, I guess the point here, the point for the podcast and talking about it, is to encourage teachers, senseis, to take a hard look at yourself of why you're teaching,
yeah.
and why you're maybe emotionally upset about classes and students.
Yeah.
Right. And ask those hard questions. Is it because, you know, for us, you know, for me, for the hardest time was I'd see a student go, oh, he's a lifer, or he's got ability, right? And I would attach myself to that emotionally. Mm. And, you know, yeah, I think it was one of those lessons I had to learn. You know, like for me, the student that I attached myself to that, I mean, I poured time into him as much as I could, right? And then he got to a certain age, was like, yeah, I'm going to do something else.
Yeah.
You know, he enjoyed fitness. He really enjoyed working out. He enjoyed that stuff. And then that's where his life kind of curtailed into that, mm-hmm. which I'm glad, because he's successful in what he does. Mm-hmm. He's happy. It seems like he's happy. So it's all good, right? From now looking at it. But at that moment when he stepped off or he started doing other things, I was like, man, like I was emotional. I was depressed. Mm-hmm. Like what could I have done better? Was I too pushing this or that, right? And I owned that. Mm-hmm. And instead of stepping back, you know what? I was an avenue for him to figure out that's what he liked to do, mm-hmm. right? Because in those classes, that during the time he took those classes, we did a lot of like calisthenics, a lot of different kind of workout ideas.
And you could have introduced that to him, yeah.
Right, I could have been the influence to brought him to something that's happier.
Yeah.
But I didn't see it.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't karate.
Right.
Oh, and that was like, oh man.
Yeah.
You know, if I could go back to the students I had when I first opened my dojo in Ocala, and be like, dude, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I am so sorry that I imposed what my ideas of what karate is onto you. It should have been me teaching you karate and letting you create that picture for yourself.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Oh, if only I could go back. Right?
Yeah. So. Go back and fix messed up relationships.
Well, just
not go back and accomplish, the goals.
No, I wouldn't change personally. I wouldn't change anything in my life. It got me to a good spot, right?
Yeah.
But the guilt of being that guy in someone else's life.
Yeah.
That bothers me.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I think I would encourage instructors to, in our experience, it's part of the process. If you're dedicated enough to become an instructor and actually run a dojo where you've got multiple classes going, it's not just a club, I think there is a part of that where you're like, yes, I'm going to influence all of these students and they're going to be just like me. It's going to be awesome and we're going to have our Cobra Kai team and all of this. I think that's a stage that you have to work through.
Yeah. No.
And if you don't work through it, then your dojo might be doomed.
Well, that or your dojo, it could be successful.
Yeah, it could be.
But you're going to attract the same kind of person.
Yeah. Yeah. Rather than having a nice variety and community of people who are just
you're
there
going to have
for
a
different reasons.
bunch of mini-me's running around with a bunch of mini-mom and dads. And
yeesh. Yeah.
It's a lot of all the same things, kind of boring.
So we're judging you.
No, we're not judging you,
we
but
are.
Secretly we are.
We are. So, what you working on?
Wow. So,
wait, from my perspective. So we get into class yesterday. Yesterday was the second time it was actual class, I guess, sort of. And Jeremiah's like, hey, I think we should change the plan of what we were going to do. And I'm like, okay. He's like, maybe we should just do some, review what we did yesterday. And then Steve's like, well, you could just do Heian katas because the principles are the same. So we did Heian Shodan.
We did Heian Shodan for almost the whole time.
For like an hour.
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's personally, it's getting better footwork into the rotations, pivots, shifts, and then creating proper boundaries, proper support in the stances, and everything else, The
knee moving thing though is it's so difficult because it means that you've got a lot of strength in your hip, but then you're not controlling how much of that you're using in the stance, and then you're just kind of keep going. Man, and that's I think we all go through that too. Yeah.
So it is what it is.
Yeah.
What are you working on?
Apparently I can't do a rising block, so there's
that. I can't punch straight.
It was the rising block timing, and then in general, transitions, trying to not come up between transitions. That's something I've worked on for a few years, but that any kind of stepping or turning in particular is really hard because you're trying not to come up for the sake of building athleticism. You're trying to stay down in the stance, do the pivot, not stick your butt out behind you, all that kind of stuff. And we worked on that quite a bit. And then we did actually get into Handidan. So we did an hour of Hand Shodan, and then we did about 30 minutes of Handidan. We didn't even get through the whole thing. We got through half the kata.
Yeah.
And actually the second move, well, I call it second move. So the arm crossing after that big square block at the beginning, that arm crossing movement, it was eye-opening to, even though I've heard him say that you're supposed to tense on the point of impact, you forget that the point of impact or the point of contact with the other person may not necessarily be at the end of the path of the movement.
Right.
It may be earlier in the movement, and I know that, but I only now think about it when it comes to punches and kicks. I don't think about it with blocks.
Right.
So that was kind of eye-opening to work on that a little bit. I don't know. I think there was other stuff too, but that was kind of the main thing. Yeah. Those were the main things yesterday. And then we went through Wongun.
Yeah, a little bit.
So.
Yeah.
Kind of the same stuff there.
Yeah, I kept kind of decouple my shoulder.
Oh yeah.
I'm not not controlling my punches through my lats. I'm just punching to the extent of my arm.
Just throwing the arm out there. Yeah.
So learning how to do that better and just being more conscious of it.
Yeah.
So.
Got to be a tight ass. Pull your shoulders back like this all the time. That's with you. So I'm sure we'll have more fun things after today that we can hopefully share. Hopefully. I'm not going to say hopefully because I have not finished taking my notes from the first day. So.
Oh, wow. And
it was already over a page of just notes on Busted Eye. I didn't even get to the rest of them.
Yeah.
So anyway, oops.
Oops.
Okay, guys, it's been real.
Bye. Bye.